The darling, ruined mare! Oh, what have I done?" A crowd of men, a doctor and his assistant, the officers of his regiment, ran up to him. To his misery, he felt that he was whole and unhurt. The mare had broken her back, and it was decided to shoot her. Vronsky couldn't answer questions, couldn't speak to anyone. He turned, and without picking up his cap, which had fallen off, he walked away from the track, not knowing where he was going. He felt utterly wretched. For the first time in his life, he knew the bitterest sort of misfortune, misfortune beyond remedy, misfortune his own fault. Yashvin overtook him with his cap and led him home, and half an hour later Vronsky had regained his self-possession. But the memory of that race remained long in his heart, the cruelest and bitterest memory of his life. Chapter 26. Outwardly, the relation of Alexey Alexandrovitch and his wife had remained unchanged. The only difference lay in the fact that he was more busily occupied than ever. As in former years, at the beginning of the spring, he had gone to a foreign spa for the sake of his health, weakened by the winter's work that every year grew heavier. And, just as always, he returned in July, and at once began to work as usual with increased energy. As usual, too, his wife had moved for the summer to a villa out of town, while he remained in Petersburg. From the date of their conversation after the party at Princess Tverskaya's, he had never again spoken to Anna of his suspicions and his jealousies, and that habitual tone of his bantering mimicry was the most convenient tone possible for his present attitude toward his wife. He was a little colder to her. He simply seemed to be slightly displeased with her for that first midnight conversation which she had repelled. In his attitude toward her, there was a shade of vexation, but nothing more. "You would not be frank with me," he seemed to say, mentally addressing her. "So much the worse for you. Now you may beg as you please. But I won't be frank with you. So much the worse for you," he said, mentally, like a man who, after vainly attempting to extinguish a fire, should fly into a rage with his vain efforts and say, "Oh, very well then, you shall burn for this." This man, so subtle and astute in official life, didn't realize all the senselessness of such an attitude toward his wife. He didn't realize it because it was too terrible to him to realize his actual position, and he shut down and locked and sealed up in his heart that secret place where his feelings toward his family, that is, his wife and son, lay hidden. He, who had been such a concerned father, had from the end of that winter become peculiarly cold to his son, and adopted toward him just the same bantering tone he used with his wife. "Aha, young man," was the greeting with which he met him. Alexey Alexandrovitch asserted and believed that he had never in any previous year had so much official business as that year. But he was not aware that he sought work for himself that year, that this was one of the means for keeping shut that secret place where his feelings towards his wife and son and his thoughts about them lay hidden, and which became more terrible the longer they lay there. If anyone had had the right to ask Alexey Alexandrovitch what he thought of his wife's behavior, the mild and peaceable Alexey Alexandrovitch would have made no answer, but he would have been greatly angered with any man who should question him on that subject. For this reason, Alexey Alexandrovitch's face took on a look of haughtiness and severity whenever anyone inquired after his wife's health. Alexey Alexandrovitch didn't want to think at all about his wife's behavior, and he actually succeeded in not thinking about it at all. Karenin's permanent summer villa was in Peterhof, and the Countess Lydia Ivanovna used to generally spend the summer there, close to Anna, constantly seeing her. That year, Countess Lydia Ivanovna declined to settle in Peterhof, was not once at Anna Arkadyevna's, and in conversation with Alexey Alexandrovitch hinted at the unsuitability of Anna's intimacy with Betsy and Vronsky. Karenin sternly cut her short, roundly declaring his wife to be above suspicion, and from that time began to avoid the Countess. He didn't want to see, and did not see, that many people in society cast dubious glances on his wife. He did not want to understand, and didn't understand, why his wife had so particularly insisted on staying at Tsarskaya, where Betsy was staying, not far from the camp of Vronsky's regiment. He didn't allow himself to think about it, and he didn't think about it. But all the same, though he never admitted it to himself and had no proof, not even suspicions, in the bottom of his heart he knew beyond all doubt that he was a deceived husband, and he was profoundly miserable about it. How often during those 8 years of happy life with his wife he had looked at other men's faithless wives and other deceived husbands and asked himself, how can people descend to that? How is it they don't put an end to such a hideous situation? But now, when the misfortune had come upon himself, he was so far from thinking of putting an end to the situation that he wouldn't recognize it at all, would not recognize it just because it was too awful, too unnatural. Since his return from abroad, Alexey Alexandrovich had been at their country villa twice. Once he dined there, the other time he spent the evening there with a party of friends. But neither time did he stay overnight, as it had been his habit to do in previous years. The day of the races had been a very busy one for Alexey Alexandrovich, but when mentally sketching out the day in the morning, he made up his mind to go to their country house to see his wife immediately after dinner, and from there to the races, at which the whole court would be, and at which he would be present. He was going to see his wife because he had determined to see her once a week to keep up appearances. And besides, on that day, as it was the 15th, he had to give his wife some money for their expenses, according to their usual agreement. With his habitual control over his thoughts, though he thought all this about his wife, he didn't let his thoughts stray further in regard to her. That morning was a very full one for Alexey Alexandrovich. The evening before, Countess Lydia Ivanovna had sent him a pamphlet by a celebrated traveller in China who was staying in Petersburg, and with it she enclosed a note begging him to see the traveller himself, as he was an extremely interesting person from various points of view, and likely to be interesting and useful to them. Karenin had not had time to read the pamphlet through in the evening, and finished it in the morning. Then people began arriving with petitions, and there came the reports, interviews, appointments, dismissals, apportionment of rewards, pensions, grants, notes, the workaday round, as he called it, that always took up so much time. Then there was private business of his own, a visit from the doctor and his manager. The manager didn't take up much time. He simply gave Alexey Alexandrovich the money he needed with a brief statement of the condition of his affairs, which was not altogether satisfactory, as it had happened that during that year, owing to increased expenses, more had been paid out than usual, and there was a deficit. But the doctor, a celebrated Petersburg doctor, who was an intimate acquaintance of Alexey Alexandrovich's, took up a great deal of time. Karenin had not expected him that day, and was surprised at his visit, still more so when the doctor questioned him very carefully about his health, listened to his breathing, and tapped at his liver. Karenin didn't know that his friend Lydia Ivanovna, noticing that he was not as well as usual that year, had begged the doctor to go and examine him. "Do this for my sake," the Countess had said to him. "I will do it for the sake of Russia, Countess," replied the doctor. "A priceless man," said the Countess. The doctor was extremely dissatisfied with Alexey Alexandrovich. He found the liver considerably enlarged, and the digestive powers weakened, while the course of mineral waters had been quite without effect. He prescribed more physical exercise as far as possible, and as far as possible less mental strain, and above all, no worry. In other words, just what was as much out of Alexey Alexandrovich's power as abstaining from breathing. Then he withdrew, leaving in Alexey Alexandrovich an unpleasant sense that something was wrong with him, and that there was no chance of curing it. As he was coming away, the doctor chanced to meet on the staircase an acquaintance of his, Sludin, who was Karenin's secretary. They had been comrades at the university, and though they rarely met, they thought highly of each other and were excellent friends. And so there was no one to whom the doctor would have given his opinion of a patient more freely. "How glad I am you've been seeing him," said Sludin. "He's not well, and I think—" "Well, what do you think of him?" "I'll tell you," said the doctor, beckoning over Sludin's head to his coachman to bring the carriage round. "It's just this," said the doctor, taking a finger of his kid glove in his white hands and pulling it. "If you don't strain the strings, you'll find it difficult to break them. But strain a string to its very utmost, and the mere weight of one finger on the strained string will snap it." And with his close assiduity, his conscientious devotion to his work, he strained to the utmost. "And there's some outside burden weighing on him, and not a light one," concluded the doctor, raising his eyebrows significantly. "Will you be at the races?" he added, as he sank into his seat in the carriage. Yes, to be sure. It does waste a lot of time," the doctor responded vaguely to some reply of Sludin's he hadn't caught. After the doctor, who had taken up so much time, came the celebrated traveller, and Alexey Alexandrovitch, by means of the pamphlet he had just finished reading and his previous acquaintance with the subject, impressed the traveller by the depth of his knowledge of the subject and the breadth and enlightenment of his views. At the same time as the traveller, there was announced a provincial marshal of nobility on a visit to Petersburg, with whom Alexey Alexandrovitch had to have some conversation. After his departure, he had to finish the daily routine of business with his secretary, and then he still had to drive round to call on a certain important person on a matter of grave and serious import. Alexey Alexandrovitch just managed to be back by 5 o'clock, his dinner hour, and after dining with his secretary, he invited him to drive with him to his country villa and to the races. Though he didn't acknowledge it to himself, Karenin always tried nowadays to secure the presence of a third person in his interviews with his wife. Chapter 27. Anna was upstairs, standing in front of the mirror, and with Anushka's assistance, pinning the last ribbon on her gown, when she heard carriage wheels crunching the gravel at the entrance. "It's too early for Betsy," she thought, and glancing out of the window, she caught sight of the carriage and the black hat of Alexey Alexandrovitch, and the ears she knew so well sticking up on each side of it. How unfortunate! Can he be going to stay the night? She wondered, and the thought of what might come of such a possibility struck her as so awful and terrible that without dwelling on it for a moment, she went down to meet him with a bright and radiant face. And conscious of the presence of that spirit of falsehood and deceit in herself, which she had come to know of late, she abandoned herself to that spirit and began talking, hardly knowing what she was saying. "Oh, how nice of you," she said, giving her husband her hand, and greeting Sludin, who was like one of the family, with a smile. "You're staying for the night, I hope," was the first word the spirit of falsehood prompted her to utter. "And now we'll go together. Only it's a pity I've promised Betsy. She's coming for me." Alexey Alexandrovitch knit his brows at Betsy's name. "Oh, I'm not going to separate the inseparables," he said in his usual bantering tone. "I'm going with Mikhail Vassilievich. I'm ordered to exercise by the doctors, too. I'll walk and imagine myself at the spa again." "There's no hurry," said Anna. "Would you like tea?" She rang. "Bring in tea, and tell Seryozha that Alexey Alexandrovitch is here." "Well, tell me, how have you been?" "Mikhail Vassilievich, you've not been to see me before. Look how lovely it is out on the terrace," she said, turning first to one and then to the other. She spoke very simply and naturally, but too much and too fast. She was the more aware of this from noticing in the inquisitive look Mikhail Vassilievich turned on her that he was, as it were, keeping watch on her. Mikhail Vassilievich promptly went out onto the terrace. She sat down beside her husband. "You don't look well," she said. "Yes," he said. "The doctor's been with me today and wasted an hour of my time. I feel that one of our friends must have sent him. My health's so precious, it seems." "No? What did he say?" She questioned him about his health and what he had been doing, and tried to persuade him to take a rest and come stay with her. All this she said brightly, rapidly, and with a peculiar brilliance in her eyes. But Karenin didn't now attach any special significance to this tone of hers. He heard only her words, and gave them only the direct sense they bore, and he answered simply, though jesting. There was nothing singular in this conversation, but Anna could never recall this brief scene without an agonizing pang of shame. Seryozha came in, preceded by his governess. If Alexey Alexandrovitch had allowed himself to observe, he would have noticed the timid and bewildered eyes with which Seryozha glanced first at his father and then at his mother. But he would not see anything, and he didn't see it. "Ah, the young man. He's grown. Really, he's getting to be quite a man. How are you, young man?" And he gave his hand to the scared child. Seryozha had been shy of his father before, and now, ever since Alexey Alexandrovitch had begun calling him young man, and since that insoluble question had occurred to him whether Vronsky was a friend or a foe, he avoided his father.